I'll be talking about origin of ruby in some rocks called anoctosites from the Sitampudi layered complex in South India. So before I directly start talking about the problem, just to give you a general introduction, I am a geologist, more specifically a metamorphic petrologist. So when I look at rocks, and rocks are naturally occurring aggregate of one or more minerals. So when I look at rocks, the basic and primary question that we are always trying to answer is that what were the conditions of formation? And when it deals with metamorphic rocks, so metamorphic rocks are secondary rocks because they are formed due to alteration and modification of some pre-existing sedimentary or igneous rocks. So when it comes to metamorphic rocks, these conditions usually refer to the pressures and temperatures, like during the metamorphic process, how the pressures and temperatures changed, to what extent did they change, and how they affected the rock. Was there any change in composition during the process? Did it remain the same? All of this, and of course, there's also another parameter, which is when did this process occur and for how long. So we do this by applying the principles of equilibrium thermodynamics to natural minerals and rocks. So once we have constrained the pressure temperature conditions of formation, so on the right hand side here is a very basic metamorphic facies diagram. So on the x-axis is temperature, on the y-axis going down, pressure is increasing because it's increasing downwards because we use it in this form because pressure usually increases with depth as we go down below the surface. And these colored fields indicate different metamorphic facies, which are basically like for a given composition of a whole rock, there is a characteristic set of mineral assemblages that are stable at a particular pressure temperature. So for a particular composition of a whole rock, we know how the mineral assemblages will change with time, and the colored fields represent such different characteristic assemblages. And on the left hand side is just an example of a subduction zone setting. So the colors here roughly indicate at what tectonic setting, what kind of uh, uh, pressure temperature conditions and metamorphic facies would we encounter. So basically when we constrain the pressures and temperatures of formation of a metamorphic rock, we can, depending on the research problem that we are trying to understand, one of the wider or broader or large scale questions that the we can solve is that what was the tectonic setting of formation, and then this relates to the understanding of plate tectonics and supercontinent cycles and things like that. But that basically depends on the research problem that we are working on. So coming back to today's problem, like the origin of ruby in chromiferous anoctosites. So why is the origin of ruby an interesting problem? I mean, ruby is a very precious gem mineral. It is very expensive, and that's one thing. But when it comes to mineralogy, ruby is basically aluminium oxide, which is called corundum. So the abbreviations are given in the brackets because in subsequent slides I will be using the abbreviations only. So CRN is corundum aluminium oxide, and when chromium in trace quantity substitutes for aluminium, it gives a characteristic pink red color, and that is called ruby. And for example, when titanium and iron are substitute for aluminium, it gets a blue or a greenish blue color. It's called sapphire. So the problem, so the as a metamorphic petrologist, basically I'm trying to understand how corundum can form, and then gem quality rubies. So this is interesting because when we look at rocks in the crust, these rocks are basically generally enriched in silica. and quartz as a mineral occurs in most of the crustal rocks. But to form corundum, we need a composition which is rich in aluminium but deficient in silica. This is very uncommon. And like I said, corundum never occurs in equilibrium with quartz in any crustal rocks. It cannot be stable kinetically. So that is one problem. The other is, in addition to forming corundum, I would also need to have these chromophore elements to be present, that is chromium or titanium. And the problem here is that all of these elements, like chromium, titanium, even aluminium itself, the oxides of these elements are relatively insoluble. So the elements are what we call geologically immobile elements in common metamorphic fluids. So when the rocks are experiencing metamorphism, metamorphism is basically a process where the rocks get progressively dehydrated with increasing pressures and temperatures. And in these commonly known fluids, these elements are immobile. So it is not only difficult to form corundum, it is even more difficult to have these elements present so that they can impart these colors to the corundum and form the gem minerals. And the last problem point in this case is that the major known gem deposits are of secondary origin. So, corundum has been, so ruby and sapphires are being mined since before the Second World War from primarily India, Afghanistan, Thailand, Myanmar, and most of these are, in fact, most of these are of secondary origin. So when I say secondary origin, what I mean is that the rocks from which the ruby is being mined are not the rocks in which the ruby was formed. So this can happen in two cases where, like, if it's an igneous rock that crystallized from a magma, and if that has corundum as a ruby as a xenocryst, so basically the magma from which the rock formed, that magma carried the ruby from somewhere. And then when the magma crystallized to form the igneous rock, the ruby remained trapped as a xenocryst. So then, therefore, when I'm studying the rock, I cannot understand how the ruby formed because the ruby did not form from that magma. And the other kind of secondary deposits are placer deposits. Diamond placer deposits are very common. So what placer deposits are basically sediments which are derived from some rock through superficial weathering erosion processes, and they are transported over some large distance away from the original source and redeposited. And it is from this redeposition that we placers that we mine the rubies. So again, it is not possible to constrain or understand how the rubies formed in the first place. In what kind of rocks do the rubies occur in South India? So the samples that I'm studying. So I mentioned that the names of the rock is called anorthosite, and the minerals that it formed of are basically two minerals. That is, one is plagioclase. These white layers here. This is a picture of the rock from the field area. So this is a plagioclase, which is basically calcium, sodium, aluminium silicate, and there's a complete range of solid state substitutions between calcium, aluminium, and sodium silica. So one N member is pure, what we call anorthite, which is calcium, aluminium silicate, and the other N member is albite, which is sodium, aluminium silicate. And the black minerals here are amphibole, which is hydrous silicate. So this is a dry silicate. This is a hydrous silicate containing a lot of other elements. And as far as the oxides are concerned, corundum is, of course, one of the oxides. This pink colored grain here, these are corundum. So with presence of chromium, this is here in cases ruby. Not very, this is a picture of a hand specimen. You can understand the size from the scale here. So there are small grains of chromite, which is chromium oxide, and this black corona surrounding the ruby is a spinel, which is iron, magnesium, aluminium oxide, but in this case, it contains some amount of chromium also. So these are the minerals that are found in the rocks, and the rock is named anorthosite when it comprises dominantly of plagioclase. It is called anorthosite. When it comprises dominantly of amphibole, it is called amphibolite, and in between, it's called gabbro. So gabbro is the name of the igneous rock, and if it gets metamorphosed under very high pressure temperature conditions, the name of the metamorphic rock would be basic granulite. So these are exactly the three kinds of rocks which I have found in South India. So this is a geological map of the southern tip of the Indian continent, and this belt here is called the Palghat Kaveri shear system or shear zone, and these in green here are several layered complexes, and this here is the Sitampundri layered complex. And as you can see from the different colors, the naming becomes obvious that it is an interlayering of these three different rock types: anaptosites, gabbros, and basic granulites and amphibolites. So hence these are called layered complexes. These were formed uh, during the Archean time, so 2.9 GA or something around that time, and these were formed as oceanic crusts. So present day what we see as oceanic crusts, so these were formed as oceanic crusts during the Archean, and subsequently through various metamorphic processes they got trapped in these surrounding pink colored what we call gneissic rocks and experience metamorphic events. So these are the rocks. So how do the corundum or the ruby occurs in the rock? So this is just a picture of the some separated gem rubies from these rocks. I forgot to mention that rubies are not. This is just the Sitampundri layered complex, but gem quality ruby is mined all along this belt. So there are several such layered complexes along these belt, and ruby is mined from all along these areas. So this gives me a unique opportunity actually to understand how the rubies formed, because this is one of the very few examples in the world where gem quality rubies are mined from the rocks in which they were formed. So these are primary deposits of rubies. So how do the rubies occur in the rocks? They occur as such big grains. So this is a cross section of this grain. So it is beautiful hexagonal cross section, which after its formation, due to subsequent metamorphic process, it got broken down. This was a single grain actually, so it got broken down, and then it got replaced by some other black colored minerals surrounding it. So here actually you see a chromite rich layer, and chromite is also mined from the areas. So these layers can be very rich and economically viable. So here is another corundum crystal. But when we are in a domain of a rock where there is no chromite in the vicinity, we have only colorless corundum forming. So the mode of occurrence is very similar of corundum here and corundum here, but this is colorless because it has no chromium. So it becomes obvious just by studying the rocks in the field when we do field work in the area, that chromium is the source, that the chromites are the source of chromium in the ruby. So whenever the corundum is occurring in the vicinity of chromite, it gets chromium and gets the pink color and forms ruby. But then the question still remains that how did the corundum itself form? So unless the corundum forms, there is no ruby. There's no ruby or no sapphires or anything. So this is where, as a metamorphic petrologist, the first step when we are looking at thin sections or even at smaller or scanning electron microscope images. So the first step that we have to carry out is determine the sequence in which the minerals formed in the rock. So what minerals formed early, what minerals formed after that. So like I said, the corundum crystals got broken down and got replaced by these black rims of spinel. So the sequence that we have from the rock was that first during the peak metamorphism. So peak metamorphism is basically the maximum pressure temperature of metamorphism. So during that phase, these three minerals, so anorthite, amphibole, and corundum, was stable together. And then subsequently during retrogression from the peak stages, corundum and amphibole reacted to form anorthite and spinel. But this anorthite amphibole corundum, this mineral assemblage is not very common. It is very rarely found in the world. So this makes the understanding of how corundum can form in this assemblage even more difficult. Other than the South Indian samples, there are only a very few examples in the world. So from Spain, Japan, and Morocco, where in some complexes where very similar looking rocks occur. So it's you see here is pink colors corundum, there's spinel, there's plagioclase, but the other minerals in this area, this has different minerals. This has clinopyroxene and garnet and olivine, whereas we have amphibole and some amount of chromite. So not only is the mineral assemblage in the rest of the rock very different, but because of this, this assemblage formed at much different pressure temperature conditions, 18 kilobars, 1000 degrees Celsius. So at these pressure temperature conditions, amphibole would never be stable. It would break down to form clinopyroxene, which is a anhydrous mineral, and amphibole is a hydrosilicate. So not only is the mineral assemblage different, but in the South Indian rocks, so basically from the basic granulites, it has been constant that the peak metamorphic conditions here are somewhere around 11 to 13 kilobars and 800 degrees Celsius. So these are very different conditions. So the mechanism of formation of corundum in these known rocks is not applicable in our studied samples. So we need to think of something else to understand and explain the formation of corundum in the rocks. So now we look at the composition of the minerals in our rocks. So going back, in this case, the plagioclase here in the rock is a solid solution of sodium and calcium. But when we looked at the plagioclase in our studied rocks, so this is just a complete composition diagram. On the right hand side is the calcic end member anorthite, on the left hand side is the sodic end member albite, and what I have cropped out here is basically this calcium rich end. So we can see that these bars represent the range of composition of plagioclase that we have in our samples. And we see that in the South Indian sample, so this is one area, Sitampumdi, that I'm talking about now. There are two other areas here from nearby localities. And we see that the mole percent of the anorthite end member is quite high. It's almost above 90. And this, when it's above 90, we call it pure end member anorthite. So we have almost pure anorthite instead of a sodic calcic plagioclase in our rocks. And this is exceptional. This is exceptional because we have only one other known locality in the world, so you can understand how rare it is. So this prompted us to look into the phenomenon of incongruent melting of anorthite. So incongruent melting is a phenomena where basically a solid, instead of melting as it is, it melts to form a solid of a different composition and a melt. So anorthite does melt incongruently to form corundum plus melt. And this is a phase diagram. On the y-axis we have pressure and here is temperature. This was derived experimentally. The composition is calcium aluminium silicate here. So this yellow field is that of solid anorthite. This is completely melt of same composition, and here in gray we have the incongruent melting field where corundum becomes stable. But if we take a look at the pressures and temperatures, it's more than 1550 degrees Celsius, less than 10 kilobar, and these conditions are impossible to attain during any process of crustal metamorphism. But because these experiments were done with pure anorthite, this leaves us a room for a lot of exploration. So we wanted to explore how the presence of fluids and sodium affect the incongruent melting behavior, because it is known for all other rock types that the presence of fluids, whether pure H2O or solid or a solution of H2O CO2, the presence of fluid usually helps to suppress the melting point of the rocks. So in order to do that, we can no longer use a pressure temperature isochemical diagram. Therefore we have temperature on the y-axis, some compositional parameter on the x-axis, which is x0 is the pure solid, and along the x-axis we are adding water. These are now numerically computed using a software. So this is in the with anorthite composition 100, what we call for pure calcium aluminum silicate, which is called the CaSH system. And then we recomputed these diagrams for different compositions of anorthite by adding more and more sodium. So anorthite 95, the mole percent is decreasing. So 95, 90, and 85, and so on. And these are a lot of different diagrams. So just for today, I'll discuss only one of the most important ones. So the star here is basically 1550 degrees Celsius, 9 kilobar. This is the star here. On the x-axis, water is increasing. Here is the field of solid anorthite and water. As we are increasing to the temperature, we encountered the solidus curve in yellow, and then we encountered the stability of corundum. And here is all of it is melt. So we see that with the addition of water and sodium to the system, the solidus temperatures are greatly reduced from 1550 degrees Celsius to about 950 degrees Celsius, and corundum appears at about 1000 degrees Celsius and 9 kilobar. This is very much in the realm of ultra-high temperature granulite facies metamorphism. So going back to the diagram that I showed you in the first slide, so this can these pressure temperatures conditions of can be attained during any collision and orogeny with some additional advective heat transport. And I mentioned previously that after its formation, the corundum grains broke down, and then they formed some other minerals, and this was a metamorphic event that formed during 2.48 billion years ago. And it obviously means that the corundum formation through this metamorphism occurred during a separate event. And so the study not just I set out to explore how the rubies formed in the rocks, and in turn, it not only helped me explain the mechanism of ruby formation, but it also helped me to find out that this happens to be the first record of such old and high-grade metamorphism from southern India. So this metamorphic event, the blue star here, this is very widely reported from the region, and this happens to be older than this high pressure metamorphic event, and this is in turn it does have a lot of wider applications in terms of understanding archaeocrustal evolution and tectonics worldwide, because there are only a dozen such reported localities of such old high grade metamorphic events from the world. So this you can that a petrological study that I set out to understand the origin of rubies also does have a far wide-reaching applications. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Shreya. That was a lovely talk. I have a question for you, but I'll ask it to you after. There is another question in the chat box from G. Bhaskaran, and he says the Deccan Plateau was formed by volcanic activities. Sitampudi village in Tamil Nadu is part of the Deccan Plateau. So are you saying that some special volcanic eruption brought corundum, etc., from below?
Okay, so I'll just share my screen once again, because yeah. So going back to the map I showed you, so this, like I said, is the southern tip of the India. So geologically speaking, the Deccan Plateau or the Deccan Volcanics, it ends northern of this area. So this area is no longer Deccan Plateau. So yeah, this map, if you look at in the inset here, so I have three different gray shaded areas. So Deccan is somewhere in this white area here. It's no longer Deccan Volcanics here. So this is the southern granulite terrain. So yeah, to answer your question, it is not some volcanic eruption that brought corundum from below. It is basically during the Archean time, oceanic crust was formed like it forms in today's time at mid-ocean ridges due to mantle venting, and then these oceanic rocks of the oceanic crust they got subducted and experienced metamorphism under high pressure temperature conditions. So yeah, this cartoon might help you to understand. So an oceanic crust can get subducted, but depending on the density contrast between these two crusts, the subduction may not happen at such a steep angle. So instead of going straight down into the mantle, it can happen at a much lower angle in this area. So if it comes in this area, then you can see it's in the granulite facies pressure temperature realm, and then corundum can form in this rocks through metamorphism.
Right.
I hope I was clear in.
Yes, absolutely. I have a question for you with regard to Myanmar, South India, and Kashmir, because we know that these are the three places where sapphires and rubies are much sought after and are obtained. So, do you think in Myanmar also you have Archean rocks and in Kashmir too, or what is your explanation there?
Kashmir specifically, I'm not aware. I'm more aware of the Kashmir, Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush range. But Myanmar, Thailand ruby deposits are. I gave the example that in the beginning that most ruby deposits are secondary deposits. So when a magma just carries corundum from somewhere and brings it where it's crystallizing to form the rock, so then it's called a xenocryst. So the Myanmar, Thailand deposits are basically xenocrystic deposits. So the corundum or ruby in those rocks did not form from the magma itself. The rocks are not as old as Archean; they are much younger, and the magma just carried the ruby from somewhere deep within. It did not form in here. And Kashmir, I'm specifically not aware, but Afghanistan, if I can recall, those are hosted in marbles. So again, those are very young rocks in the Hindu Kush Himalaya system.
And what about ruby and sapphires in Sri Lanka?
Ruby and sapphires in Sri Lanka are similar. So also in South India and elsewhere. So we have these rocks called pegmatites. So what happens is there are two rocks that are occurring adjacent to each other. One is very deficient in silica, what we call them silica undersaturated rocks, and because the adjacent rocks are rich in silica, so during metamorphism, because of this concentration gradient, the silica deficient rocks become even more deficient, and they are already enriched in aluminium, so corundum can form, or rubies and sapphires can form in those rocks. And just depending on the availability of either chromium or titanium, it gets either becomes ruby or sapphire. So
right, absolutely. Just my last comment,
yes,
because if I'm thinking about Sri Lanka having, actually been part of the Indian plate. So I was wondering, and then we had the separation. So do you want to comment on Sri Lanka and India and the ruby deposits or the sapphire deposits? So we can talk about that later because this is fascinating.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah?
Yes, Sri Lanka and rocks are similar, but it's not exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shreya.
Thank you, ma'am.